The Galactic Prosperity Collective had always prided itself on being the most enlightened civilization the galaxy had ever produced. Not that they'd asked anyone else's opinion, mind you, but when you've conquered 3/4 of known space, while maintaining the pretense of being benevolent shepherds, asking becomes rather optional. For 2 centuries, the collective had operated under a simple principle. Lesser species needed guidance, protection, and most importantly, management. The crystalline Vexi provided the bureaucratic backbone, their silicon-based minds perfectly suited to processing the endless paperwork required to run a galactic empire. The crustacean Korthek handled military affairs with the sort of methodical brutality that came naturally to a species that had evolved from predatory sea creatures, and the gaseous Yilnos served as the intellectual class, their vast communal consciousness convinced of their own superiority, with the kind of arrogance that only comes from never being wrong about anything important. Then there were the humans. The humans, the collective's favorite pet project. When humanity had stumbled into galactic society 200 years ago, with their charmingly primitive fusion drives and their adorable nuclear weapons, the collective had collectively cooed like doting grandparents. Here was a species that showed promise, they'd decided. Bipedal, reasonably intelligent, and blessed with just enough aggression to be useful without being threatening. Perfect material for their designated role as the galaxy's peacekeepers. It had been Chancellor Vexthai's idea, originally. Why waste collective resources on maintaining order when you could train the humans to do it for you? They were naturally inclined toward conflict resolution, had a peculiar obsession with fairness, and possessed an almost pathological need to help the underdog. Give them some hand-me-down technology, a pat on the head, and they'd police the galaxy's trouble spots with the enthusiasm of children playing space cops. The arrangement had worked beautifully. Humans mediated disputes, provided humanitarian aid, and generally made themselves useful, while the collective's real powers concentrated on more important matters like expanding trade routes and cataloging new species to uplift. The humans seemed genuinely grateful for the opportunity to serve, their representatives always so earnest and diplomatic in the great halls of power. Admiral Korthak had occasionally expressed concerns about giving the humans too much autonomy, but Dr. Yilnos had always dismissed such worries with the sort of condescending patience reserved for explaining simple concepts to children. Humans, the good doctor would explain, were fundamentally limited by their biology. Their short lifespans prevented them from developing truly long-term thinking, and their emotional nature made them predictably manipulable. They were useful tools, nothing more. The collective had grown so comfortable with this arrangement that they'd almost forgotten it was an arrangement at all. Humanity's role, as the galaxy's designated helpers, had become as natural and unremarkable as gravity or the speed of light. When the collective needed someone to clean up a mess, they called the humans. When they needed someone to take the blame for an operation gone wrong, they called the humans. When they needed someone to die for principles the collective couldn't be bothered to uphold themselves, well, the humans were always so willing to volunteer. Which made what happened next all the more shocking. The trouble began, as troubles often do, with something that should have been routine. The mining world of Kepler 442b had been experiencing labor disputes. Nothing unusual there. The collective's resource extraction operations occasionally generated friction with local populations. The standard solution was to deploy peacekeeping forces to restore order, typically with enough force to discourage future dissent while maintaining plausible deniability about civilian casualties. The humans had established a small colony on Kepler 442b decades earlier, part of their ongoing expansion into the outer spiral arms. New Brisbane, they'd called it, populated by some 2.5 million souls, engaged in the sort of mundane activities that characterized human settlements everywhere. Farming, manufacturing, raising families, and generally being industrious in that peculiarly human way. The collective's military response to the labor disputes had been textbook standard: orbital bombardment to eliminate resistance strongholds, followed by ground forces to secure vital infrastructure. The fact that New Brisbane happened to be situated uncomfortably close to several legitimate military targets was simply an unfortunate coincidence. The fact that the orbital bombardment had been somewhat indiscriminate was merely a tactical necessity. The fact that New Brisbane had been completely obliterated, along with its entire population, was regrettable collateral damage. Admiral Korthak had filed the standard paperwork. Chancellor Vexthai had approved the standard reparations package. Dr. Yilnos had prepared the standard academic justification for why the operation had been both necessary and proportionate. The collective had expected the humans to accept the standard expressions of regret and move on with their lives, as they always did. The humans, however, had apparently misplaced their copy of the script. Ambassador Marcus Chen had been humanity's representative to the collective for 15 years, a career diplomat, known for his measured responses and careful consideration of all perspectives. When he requested an emergency session of the Collective Council, the alien leadership had assumed he would present the usual human response to tragedy, a stirring speech about the value of life, a request for meaningful reforms, and ultimately an acceptance of whatever token gestures the collective deigned to offer. Instead, Chen had walked into the chamber, placed a small device on the central podium, and delivered a statement that would later be studied by xenosociologists as the moment everything changed. The Terran Federation, he had said, his voice carrying none of its usual diplomatic warmth, hereby withdraws from all treaties, agreements, and cooperative arrangements with the Galactic Prosperity Collective, effective immediately. We will no longer serve as your peacekeepers, your mediators, or your convenient scapegoats. We will no longer pretend that your guidance is anything other than manipulation, or your benevolence anything other than condescension dressed up in pretty words. The device on the podium had begun to emit a low, steady tone. The sound, Chen had continued, is a quantum beacon. Every human ship, every human station, every human world is now receiving this signal. By the time I finish speaking, the Terran Federation will have effectively ceased to exist as a member of your galactic community. What happens next depends entirely on whether you're capable of learning from your mistakes. Chancellor Vexthai had attempted to interject, his crystalline form shifting through several color patterns that indicated confusion and mild alarm. Ambassador Chen, surely this is an emotional response to a tragic but unavoidable incident. The collective is prepared to discuss additional compensation. No, Chen had said, and the single word had carried such finality that even Admiral Korthak's mandibles had clicked shut. You had 200 years to learn that we are not your pets. You had 200 years to treat us as equals rather than useful animals. You had 200 years to understand that patience and diplomacy are choices, not limitations. You chose to see our restraint as weakness, our cooperation as submission, our mercy as naivety. The ambassador had picked up his device and turned toward the chamber's exit. You wanted to see what humanity looks like when we stop pretending to be civilized? Congratulations, you're about to find out. The first sign that something had fundamentally changed came 3 days later, when human merchant vessels simply stopped arriving at collective ports. No announcement, no explanation, no communication of any kind. They just weren't there anymore. Trade routes that had operated with clockwork precision for decades suddenly found themselves missing a crucial component. The second sign came when the collective's intelligence services tried to investigate what was happening in human space and discovered that they couldn't. Every probe they sent into Terran territory simply vanished. Every attempt to establish communication was met with silence. It was as if humanity had simply pulled a curtain across their portion of the galaxy and vanished behind it. Dr. Yilnos had been the first to recognize the implications. This is impossible, the collective consciousness had declared during an emergency session of the Inner Council. Human technology is derivative of our own systems. We know their capabilities, their limitations, their infrastructure. They cannot simply disappear from our sensors. Admiral Korthak had been less concerned with the theoretical impossibility and more focused on the practical problem. Our trade networks are beginning to destabilize. Human shipping handled 37% of our intersystem cargo transport. Without them, we're looking at supply shortages within weeks. Chancellor Vexthai had attempted to maintain bureaucratic optimism. Surely this is a temporary situation. The humans have always been emotional, but they're also practical. They need our technology, our protection, our markets. They'll return to the table once they've had time to process their grief. The third sign had arrived in the form of energy signatures that shouldn't have existed. Deep space monitoring stations throughout collective territory began detecting anomalous readings from the direction of human space, power outputs that dwarfed anything in the collective's databases, gravitational disturbances that suggested the presence of massive structures where none had existed before. Most disturbing of all, temporal fluctuations that indicated the use of technologies the collective had deemed theoretically impossible. "They're building something," Admiral Korthak had reported to the Council, his usual military composure cracking slightly. "Something big. Something that's generating more power than our entire home fleet." Dr. Yilnos had dismissed this as clearly impossible. Human industrial capacity is well documented. They lack the resources for major construction projects. Their technology is centuries behind our own. Whatever you're detecting, it cannot be of human origin. The fourth sign had been the realization that the collective had been phenomenally, catastrophically wrong about everything. It started with the outer colonies. Collective mining operations, research stations, and administrative centers that had operated for decades suddenly found themselves facing visitors. Not the familiar human diplomatic vessels with their polite requests and carefully worded protests, but something else entirely. Ships that appeared without warning, bypassed every defense system as if they didn't exist, and delivered messages that were notable primarily for their complete lack of diplomatic language. The first message had been delivered to Mining Station Theta 7, a resource extraction facility that had been operating in the Outer Rim for 30 years. The human vessel had appeared directly inside the station's defensive perimeter, ignoring shields and weapons systems that should have been impenetrable. A single figure in powered armor had walked through the station's blast doors as if they were made of paper, marched directly to the command center, and delivered a message that would be repeated with minor variations throughout collective space over the following weeks. This facility has been deemed a legitimate military target by the Terran Federation. You have 6 hours to evacuate all personnel. After that time, this station will be destroyed. This is not a negotiation. This is not a request. This is a courtesy notification. Station Commander Zychnos had attempted to point out that Theta 7 was a civilian mining operation, protected under numerous interstellar treaties. The human had responded by casually tearing a support beam from the ceiling with one hand. "There are no civilians in this conflict," the figure had said. "There are only enemies and acceptable losses. You chose which category you belong to when you decided that human lives were expendable. Choose quickly." The station had been evacuated in 4 hours. The human ship had waited the full 6 before reducing the entire facility to constituent atoms, with weapons that shouldn't have existed. Similar scenes played out across collective space. Military bases, industrial complexes, research facilities, and administrative centers found themselves facing humans who bore no resemblance to the diplomatic peacekeepers the collective had grown accustomed to. These humans didn't negotiate, didn't explain, didn't seem particularly interested in minimizing casualties. They simply identified targets, provided minimal warning, and then demonstrated weapons technology that made the collective's most advanced systems look like stone tools. The pattern was always the same: appear without warning, deliver ultimatum, wait for evacuation, destroy target, disappear. No demands, no political statements, no attempts to justify their actions. Just methodical, systematic destruction of everything that made the collective function. Admiral Korthak had mobilized the home fleet after the first dozen incidents, convinced that a show of force would bring the humans back to their senses. The collective navy was, after all, the most powerful military force in known space. Their ships had maintained order across 3 sectors for over a century. Whatever the humans had done to upgrade their capabilities, they couldn't possibly match the firepower of a full battle group. The Admiral's confidence had lasted exactly 37 minutes after the fleet encountered its first human vessel. The engagement, if it could be called that, had taken place in the empty space between the Vexai home system and the nearest human colony. The collective battle group had consisted of 43 vessels, including the pride of the fleet, the dreadnought Inevitable Progress. Their opponents had been a single human ship, roughly the size of a heavy cruiser, utterly unremarkable in appearance. The human vessel had waited until the collective fleet was in optimal firing position before beginning what could only be described as a demonstration. In the space of 10 minutes, it had systematically disabled every ship in the battle group without taking a single point of damage in return. Not destroyed, disabled. Life support intact, crew unharmed, but every weapon system, every engine, every communications array reduced to expansive scrap metal. The message that followed had been broadcast on all frequencies, delivered in Admiral Korthak's own voice, by speakers that had somehow been installed in his flagship's bridge without anyone noticing. This is General Rebecca Torres of the Terran Defense Force. I want to make something very clear to anyone listening to this transmission. What you just witnessed was not a battle. It was not even a warm-up exercise. It was a courtesy demonstration, provided free of charge, so that you might begin to understand the nature of your situation. The voice had paused, and those listening could hear the sound of Admiral Korthak's mandibles clicking in what his species recognized as barely controlled panic. For 200 years you have operated under the assumption that human military capability was limited to the ships and weapons you allowed us to build. You were wrong. For 200 years you assumed that human technology was derived from your own systems and therefore inferior to them. You were wrong. For 200 years you believed that human restraint was evidence of human weakness. You were catastrophically wrong. Another pause, longer this time. Every diplomatic mission we sent, every cultural exchange we participated in, every joint training exercise we conducted was an intelligence-gathering operation. We have been studying your technology, your tactics, your capabilities, and your weaknesses for 2 centuries. We know exactly how your ships work, how your defenses operate, and how your command structure functions. We know because we built most of it. The transmission had included technical specifications for every ship in the battle group, detailed analyses of their defensive capabilities, and casual mentions of classified technologies that no human should have known existed. You see, the amusing thing about being the galaxy's designated peacekeepers is that peacekeepers need to understand both sides of every conflict. When you asked us to mediate disputes, we studied the technology and tactics of everyone involved. When you sent us to maintain order in rebellious systems, we learned how rebellion works and how to stop it. When you asked us to investigate threats to collective security, we learned exactly what those threats were and how they might be enhanced. The laughter that followed had not been pleasant. We have been preparing for this day since the moment we realized what you really thought of us. Every human ship you've seen for the past century has been a deliberate understatement of our capabilities. Every weapon system you've studied has been obsolete before you finished your analysis. Every military exercise you've observed has been carefully choreographed to show you exactly what we wanted you to see. The transmission had ended with coordinates and a timestamp. You will send representatives to these coordinates in 72 hours. They will be authorized to negotiate the complete dissolution of the Galactic Prosperity Collective and the terms of reparations for 2 centuries of subjugation. If you choose not to send representatives, we will interpret that as a decision to continue this conflict. I should mention that what you've seen so far represents approximately 3% of our actual military capacity. I trust you'll make the correct choice. The human ship had vanished, leaving behind 43 disabled vessels and a completely reorganized understanding of galactic power dynamics. The emergency session of the Collective Council that followed had been a masterpiece of recrimination and denial. Chancellor Vexthai had insisted that the humans were bluffing, that no species could have hidden such capabilities for so long. Dr. Yilnos had presented detailed mathematical proofs that human technology could not possibly be as advanced as the demonstration suggested. Admiral Korthak had argued for immediate escalation, convinced that the Collective's full military might could still overwhelm whatever the humans had managed to cobble together. They had been debating for 6 hours when the reports started arriving. Every major collective installation in human space had been simultaneously destroyed. Not just military targets, but everything. Mining operations, research stations, administrative centers, communication relays, even the luxury resort that wealthy collective citizens had built in scenic human systems. All of it, gone in the space of 10 minutes, obliterated by weapons that seemed to ignore the fundamental laws of physics. The follow-up message had been brief and to the point. 66 hours remaining. The second phase of humanity's demonstration had begun 12 hours later. Collective worlds throughout the galaxy had experienced what could only be described as technological failures. Power grids had shut down, communication networks had gone offline, transportation systems had stopped functioning. Nothing violent, nothing that endangered lives directly, but enough to make it clear that the humans had access to every system the collective relied on. The third phase had been more personal. Every member of the Collective Council had awakened to find detailed files on their personal activities, financial records and classified communications sitting on their desks. The message accompanying the files had been signed by General Torres and marked with compliments. "We thought you might be interested in seeing what we've learned about you over the years. Please note that this represents only a small sample of our intelligence gathering capabilities. We have similar files on approximately 40,000 other collective officials, military officers and business leaders. These files will be released to the public networks of your respective species in 48 hours, unless you choose to begin negotiations immediately." The files had contained information that no outsider should have possessed: private communications between council members, details of off-the-book military operations, financial records of illegal resource extraction, and personal information about families and associates. The humans hadn't just been studying collective technology, they'd been studying collective society, politics, and leadership, with the thoroughness of professional intelligence analysts. Chancellor Vexthai had been the first to break, his crystalline structure shifting through color patterns that indicated complete psychological collapse. "How?" he had asked, his harmonic voice cracking with something that might have been hysteria. "How is this possible?" The answer had come from an unexpected source. Junior analyst Kexamorda, a young Vexai who had been tasked with reviewing historical human diplomatic communications, had discovered something that should have been impossible. The linguistic analysis software had identified patterns in human diplomatic language that suggested the presence of hidden meanings, coded references and embedded data streams that had been completely invisible to collective intelligence services. "Every diplomatic message they've sent us for the past 2 centuries has been carrying hidden information," Kexamorda had reported, her structure flickering with the colors of academic excitement and existential terror. "Every cultural exchange, every trade negotiation, every peace treaty has been an intelligence operation. They've been using our own communication networks to coordinate their activities, and we never noticed, because we assumed they were too primitive to understand advanced encryption." Dr. Yilnos had attempted to maintain intellectual dignity in the face of complete professional humiliation. "This is impossible. Human computational capacity is insufficient for such complex operations. Their mathematics is centuries behind our own. Unless," Kexamorda had continued with the sort of horrible enthusiasm that comes from discovering that everything you thought you knew is wrong, "their mathematics isn't behind ours at all. Unless they've been deliberately presenting primitive versions of their technology while developing advanced systems in secret. Unless everything we think we know about human capabilities is based on carefully constructed deceptions." The implications had been staggering. If humans had been operating with deliberately concealed technology for 2 centuries, then every assumption the collective had made about galactic power dynamics was wrong. If human diplomatic missions had been intelligence-gathering operations, then the collective's security was completely compromised. If human cooperation had been a carefully orchestrated pretense, then the humans had been playing a game so complex and long-term that the collective had never even realized it was a game. Admiral Korthak had made one final attempt to salvage the situation through military action. The collective's reserve fleets, held back for exactly this sort of crisis, had been deployed to human space, with orders to eliminate the threat before it could grow beyond containment. 12 battlegroups, nearly 400 ships, armed with the most advanced weapons the collective could produce. They had encountered the human defense fleet at the edge of the Sol system, humanity's original home. The battle had been over before it began. The human fleet had consisted of ships that defied every known principle of military engineering, armed with weapons that seemed to rewrite the laws of physics, and protected by defensive systems that made the Collective's most advanced shields look like soap bubbles. The engagement had lasted 43 seconds. When it was over, the Collective fleet had been reduced to slowly expanding clouds of superheated plasma, and the human ships had barely bothered to register the encounter as noteworthy. The final message from General Torres had been delivered to every inhabited world in Collective space simultaneously, broadcast on every communication channel with the sort of technological precision that made it clear that human capabilities had been deliberately understated by several orders of magnitude. The Galactic Prosperity Collective is hereby dissolved. All member species are released from their treaty obligations and are free to govern themselves as they see fit. All collective military forces will stand down immediately. All collective government officials will prepare for transition to the new Galactic Authority. A pause, during which the population of 47 worlds had collectively realized that their understanding of the universe had just been fundamentally altered. Effective immediately, the Terran Federation assumes responsibility for maintaining order in this galaxy. We will not repeat the Collective's mistakes. We will not pretend to be benevolent shepherds while treating sentient species like children. We will not claim to protect lesser civilizations while exploiting them for our own benefit. We will, however, ensure that what happened to New Brisbane never happens again, to anyone, anywhere, for any reason. Another pause, longer this time. You wanted to see what humanity looks like when we stop pretending to be nice. This is what we look like when we stop pretending to be weak. Learn the difference, and learn it quickly, because we will not be as patient with you as you were with us. The transmission had ended with a simple statement that would be remembered as the moment the galaxy discovered that it had been living in a carefully constructed illusion for 200 years. Welcome to the new reality. Try not to disappoint us. In the aftermath, as the Collective's government structures collapsed and humanity began the complex process of reorganizing galactic civilization, xenosociologists would spend decades trying to understand how such a comprehensive deception had been possible. The answer, they would eventually conclude, lay in the fundamental difference between how humans and the former Collective species approached long-term planning. The Collective had thought in terms of immediate advantages and short-term gains. They had seen humanity's cooperation as evidence of submission, their restraint as proof of weakness, their diplomatic successes as lucky accidents rather than carefully calculated outcomes. They had been so convinced of their own superiority that they had never considered the possibility that the humans might be playing a longer game than anyone had imagined possible. Humans, it turned out, thought in terms of centuries rather than decades. They had entered galactic society with a plan that spanned generations, accepting temporary disadvantages in exchange for long-term positioning. They had allowed themselves to be underestimated, controlled, and manipulated, all while gathering intelligence, developing technology, and preparing for the day when they would no longer need to pretend to be anything other than what they were. The galaxy had spent 2 centuries learning to take humanity for granted. The humans had spent those same 2 centuries learning everything they needed to know about their supposed superiors. When the time came to drop the mask, they had been ready in ways that no one else could have anticipated. The former members of the Collective would eventually adapt to their new reality. Most species found that human rule was considerably more fair and effective than collective management had ever been. The humans, it seemed, had learned genuine lessons about leadership and governance during their time as the galaxy's designated helpers. They had simply chosen to apply those lessons with rather more authority than anyone expected. But in the quiet moments, when the former Collective leadership gathered in their comfortable exile to reminisce about the old days, they would sometimes wonder what might have been different if they had treated humanity as equals rather than useful pets. The answer, they suspected, was that they would never have discovered just how dangerous it was to underestimate a species that had built its entire civilization on the principle that every problem could be solved through sufficient application of intelligence, persistence, and controlled violence. The humans had tried being nice. When that didn't work, they had tried being diplomatic. When that failed, they had tried being patient. Now they were trying something else entirely, and the galaxy was discovering that humanity's capacity for creative problem-solving extended well beyond the boundaries of what anyone had previously considered possible. The most amusing part, from a certain perspective, was that the humans had been entirely honest about their intentions from the very beginning. They had told everyone, repeatedly and in multiple languages, that they believed in justice, equality, and the protection of the innocent. The collective had simply assumed that such ideals were weakness rather than strength, naivety rather than determination, and temporary obstacles rather than fundamental principles worth fighting for. They had been wrong about that too, but then they had been wrong about everything else, so at least they were consistent. The galaxy learned a valuable lesson that year. When a species tells you what they believe in, it's generally wise to take them at their word, especially when that species has been quietly building the largest military force in known space, while pretending to be grateful for your guidance and protection. After all, the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves about other people's limitations. The humans had simply been polite enough to let everyone else believe their own propaganda until it became inconvenient to maintain the fiction any longer. Never again, indeed.